Hello to my friends, audience, and family. This is Sunny Sharma with his last concluding Part 10 series on Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology. This will be my concluding remarks, which will basically sum up my thoughts on the five periods of American history, of different eras of American history since the founding of the Republic in 1776 on Black history. And so here I'll just let it get started. I'm not going to provide an introduction or conclusion. I'm just going to read my remarks, which I basically took me a day to write. And here we go. If you enjoyed this video podcast, please like, follow, share, and subscribe for future episodes. My podcast is called India Insight with Sunny Sharma, and my YouTube channel is Sunny Sharma at India Insight Movement. This 10-part series in honor of Black History Month in February on Black intellectual thought. These sections are based off the book Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology, which basically covers Black American history from 1768 all the way up to the seminal election of Obama in 2008. So to get started, the 1972 National Black Convention in Gary, Indiana, which sought to create a Black independent politics, was the peak of Black political consciousness. Not only did this convention boast a variety of cultural and political representatives, many of who were previous civil rights participants, it also contributed to the rise of Black political figures in the 1980s who would boast rainbow coalitions like Reverend Jesse Jackson and Harold Washington. Unfortunately, the optimism of a transformative politic and, on the other hand, revolutionary action stemming from the civil rights and Black Power movement would be short-lived. Not only would the 1980s see a growth in tough-on-crime policies towards young adult Black, brown, and people, but there would also be a shift in the systemic discrimination of Jim Crow in the South towards a new Jim Crow, the massive expansion of for-profit prisons, providing the foundation for a mass incarceration system that would imprison millions of poor people. Moreover, since the 1970s, we see a significant conservative shift in the Supreme Court and local courts in response to the legal victories of civil rights. The gospel of entrepreneurship and hard work, as inspired by Booker T. Washington, has taken precedent over agendas for more radical changes in the 1980s and onwards. With the rise of such seminal Black political leaders like President Barack Obama in 2008, it seemed as if even the lowest person in America could rise through their ability and have a chance at meritocratic success. What would be a consequence of this renewed focus on educational aspirations? And as we enter an era of even greater degrees of inequality between the lowest and highest, will we see a shift in demand for more radical politics, like what occurred in 1972 in Gary, Indiana, and during other points of American history when the racial divide was exacerbated by white racial domination? One figure in the anthology expressed that a society is only truly democratic when the lowest, weakest, and humblest member of society has the same political and participatory protections as the most powerful member of society. To Black people, the realization of this saying was the achievement of legal protections for the vote. If we go back in time to the period of abolition, activists such as the leading abolitionist of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass, was aware of the power of the vote to electing Black representatives to office. Even Black Power proponents such as Stokely Carmichael in the mid-1960s, who replaced John Lewis as the leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, knew that voting could fundamentally transform the condition of Black people in America. However, most Blacks were barred from political participation by 1901. A common theme among Black activists and intellectuals from the period of abolition to contemporary thought is a strong sense of constitutional morality that insisted, in the words of James Lawson, that the Constitution had to come alive for the full realization of political democracy, social democracy, and participatory democracy. This did not just mean legislating newfound freedoms and providing democratic protections, but also recognizing through a growth in political and class consciousness that the only real equality is economic equality. From Frederick Douglass to Thurgood Marshall to Jesse Jackson to President Obama, there is an understanding that if something is a moral right, it will become a political right. There is a higher underlying truth to our legislation enshrined in not only the Constitution, but also in biblical literature. President Lincoln and Douglass advocated against slavery because it was against natural rights and conscience. They appealed to a higher truth, which was legislated and advocated by future luminaries, whether it was Marshall or Obama. As Dr. Michelle Alexander notes, the abolition of slavery did not see the end of bondage. The institution merely transformed due to a fundamental inability of the government to live up to its promise to compensate Blacks for their years of labor. Many Blacks found themselves in a form of debt peonage under white families, which is very similar to the conditions of slavery after the Civil War, which ended in 1865. Many leaders diverted themselves away from the problems of bond labor, focusing more on expanding economic opportunity, while others established radical agendas like the Niagara Movement. However, the declaration of the Niagara Movement would only be revived in times of white animosity and division, such as the 1920s, late 1960s, and early 1970s, inspiring Marcus Garvey's UNIA Declaration, the Black Panther Party's 10-point program, the Gary Convention Declaration, the Combahee River Collective of 1974, the Black Radical Congress of 1998, and other organizations tired of the extra-legal terror towards Black people. The priest Alexander Crummell was also immensely influential on several Black leaders such as W.E.B. Du Bois. Crummell relates that fraternity was the guiding ideology pushing every revolution in the Christian era, while also insisting that a government which does not protect civil liberties should be opposed and reformed. The era of abolition and Reconstruction saw the development of many of the foundational ideas that would guide Black nationalism in the era of civil rights, and Black feminist thought that would come to life in the era of 1975 to the present. Even though the radical truth-telling and political organization of Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X was emblematic of Black nationalist ideologies, there were even more radical perspectives that sought revolutionary action. The Russian Revolution inspired thousands of Black activists, including Hubert Henry Harrison, all the way up to Fred Hampton, concerning the need for revolutionary action whereby the proletariat is united on the ideas that underlying race exploitation is class exploitation against the common enemy, private capitalism. Although in the modern era of 1975 to the present saw a shift from socialism to capitalist approaches all around the globe, it is undoubtable that Marxist strategists and theoreticians were essential to organizing poor and working class people, whether that was the Southern Tenant Farmers Union or industrial auto workers in the North, especially in the early 20th century. Nonetheless, Marxism, though providing an essential economic critique, just as the Harlem Renaissance provided an essential social critique of white oppression, could not provide a coherent, meaningful worldview of what a society without capitalism really looks like and entails, especially as it would become clearer throughout the 20th century to the mid-20th century that socialist programs around the world were dismal failures. Another philosophical approach would emerge in the 1950s, led by Dr. King, that would be more inclusive than previous ideological propositions, welcoming more people into the fold of the collective civil rights movement. Active nonviolent civil disobedience was a revolutionary new approach to combat systemic injustice in segregated cities throughout America. Through the efforts of such theoreticians as Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Rosa Parks, Reverend James Lawson, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Baird Rustin, Dr. King, and others, our society viewed the fruition of satyagraha and agape love to affect the conscience of their foe and to fundamentally highlight injustice and oppression for the whole world to see. This was not just a protest. It was a strategic grassroots targeted method to achieve legislative change in the halls of Washington. Even though Malcolm X thought America did not have a conscience, near the end of his life, he began to shift slightly towards an understanding that Dr. King's approach was not just more inclusive, but engendered a transformation in the human condition. After 1966, Dr. King began to feel that America was in danger of going down an even more dangerous path that could not be remedied. His solution to the problem became closer to Malcolm X's advocacy for Black ownership of the businesses and politics of his community and an elimination of fundamental vices like alcohol, whereby there must be a radical redistribution of wealth in society. Dr. King and Malcolm X realized America was becoming more materialistic, engendering a crisis in Western civilization. Like the African-American writer James Baldwin, they understood that the fundamental reality of most Black people was one of marginalization and oppression. The Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s and 1930s sought to redefine Black excellence, provide a place where Black people could truly express themselves, and like Cornel West endorsed, provided a sense of hope and purpose. This period also saw the rise in a Black bourgeoisie, which would only expand until the present. But would this new elite help the common man achieve political participation, get economic opportunity, and realize the sense of hope, purpose, and meaning that was so essential to the existential survival of Blacks in America? Just as Abraham Lincoln demonstrated shaping public sentiment, engaging public opinion is more important than enacting statutes and laws, public perception is equally important to legislating. Public perception has been heavily shaped by party politics and news media, which for most of the late 20th century and early 21st century has characterized the average incarcerated young Black male or juvenile as being beyond rehabilitation. Nonetheless, the efforts of the New Left movement of 1950 and 1975 created a coalition of working class people that continues to influence coordinated efforts to petition and protest for rights among unions and many other occupational groups in the contemporary era since 1975. The movement to end for-profit prisons reached a significant shift in consciousness with the publishing of Dr. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness in 2010. But many peoples view prisoners as too dangerous to be offered any opportunity at reconciliation and reform. In the modern era, there's been a substantial focus on freeing political prisoners, such as Black Panther members, as well as the most significant effort to free freedom fighters of the South African apartheid system, particularly the movement to free a leader who took on global appeal, Nelson Mandela. Like Jesse Jackson, Nelson Mandela would speak not only concerning the need to reform South Africa, but for the necessity to realize social justice for marginalized people across the globe, whether it was in Palestine or Tibet. But how did we get here? The abolition movement from 1768 to 1861 saw the birth of not just some of the first Black newspapers like the North Star, the Mystery, and Freedom's Journal, but it also was characterized by some of the greatest orators in American history like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, who advocated for natural rights which are inherent to the human condition. The era of Reconstruction, 1861 to 1915, would see Blacks striving not just for political representation, such as the vote, which despite strong advocacy would continue to be denied, but also witness Blacks entering new job opportunities in the industrial North. Unfortunately, many Blacks would realize that most unions would discriminate heavily against them during this period and onwards. Additionally, prominent Black leaders during this period, like Booker T. Washington, would navigate public opinion against more radical agendas for Blacks to gain political opportunities, such as the Niagara Movement. Furthermore, through her investigative journalism, Ida B. Wells would highlight for posterity thousands of incidences of lynching over decades, inspiring generations of Black journalists. In the era of From Plantation to Ghetto, the Great Migration, Harlem Renaissance, and World War, 1915 to 1954, there would be a rise in Jim Crow in the South in response to strong occupational movements by both Black and whites, many influenced by socialist theories based on a united proletariat and greater class consciousness, as evidenced by the 1917 Russian Revolution to fight against private capitalism, as well as the Great Migration, which would push many Blacks into industry. This era would be characterized by a burgeoning political movements led by many communists, many of whom would be marginalized for their beliefs during the era of McCarthyism after World War II. There would also be a rise in the movement of Marcus Garvey's Universal Negro Improvement Association, UNIA, a self-help organization inspired by Booker T. Washington that was more radical and criticized the pluralistic integration policy of Frederick Douglass, Du Bois, and the NAACP. Other icons, such as the socialist and well-traveled actor Paul Robinson, leading light of the Harlem Renaissance Langston Hughes, and first African-American Supreme Court Judge Thurgood Marshall would redefine Black excellence while providing an essential social critique of white oppression while speaking to the higher principles of equality and brotherhood in a world of turmoil. The decision of Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 that established separate but equal is unconstitutional, set the stage for a movement which has supported the aspirations for a successfully integrated society against Marcus Garvey's aspirations. The World Wars and Great Depression not only saw the creation of significant divides between white and Black working class, but also significant marginalization of Black women. The era of We Shall Overcome, the Second Reconstruction, 1954 to 1975, was a period when change was anticipated. All that was needed was a push from the bottom and leadership at the top that understood the urgent need for equality in a society where it was economically more feasible to have a diverse coalition of people. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, founded by Dr. King in 1957, sought the integration of Blacks in all aspects of American life, and their main weapon to appeal to conscience was active nonviolent civil disobedience. Black power was still alive, but it mainly shifted into the Black Panther Party and Black electoral politics by the beginning of the 1970s. Dr. King also shifted towards a democratic socialist perspective, growing closer to Malcolm X, while Malcolm's shift towards an internationalist perspective saw him grow closer to Dr. King. However, it was clear that the opportunities afforded to the Black bourgeoisie were not afforded to the average African American. The Black middle class grew substantially with the help of government programs such as affirmative action in the contemporary era, 1975 to the present. However, many liberal welfare programs were cut as the governmental branches shifted significantly to the right with the election of several Republican presidents. Black feminist thinkers like Dr. Bell Hooks and Audre Lorde, understanding the historical marginalization of Black women, sought to undermine any oppressive hierarchical systems in society. Furthermore, Afrocentric thinkers like Dr. Asante would recognize that education is the product of the society that produces it, whereby a white-dominated society will produce a white-dominated education. New Black bourgeoisie leaders like Louis Farrakhan would recognize that a third force is needed to break the political gridlock of the two-party system. Moreover, the 1998 Black Radical Congress, like the Gary Convention of 1972, due to changing demographics, demanded a wide range of programs from anti-police brutality, economic justice, and better rehabilitation methods for prisoners. Inspired by past creativity, America would witness the birth of hip hop activism, providing an essential social critique like the luminaries of the Harlem Renaissance concerning the conditions and adversity of Black people in America. In conclusion, the struggle for Black liberation was not only tumultuous, it was characterized by a variety of perspectives by different luminaries. Above anything else, it is important to understand the historical context and political precedents that characterize each of the 5 eras of Black history since 1768, around the founding of the American Republic in 1776. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, the rise in the KKK in the 1920s, and the assassination of Black leaders in the 1950s and 1960s significantly shifted many young African Americans towards Black power and Black nationalism during their respective eras. On the other hand, the Brown v. Board of Education of 1954 decision, the rise of McCarthyism that blacklisted Marxist activism after World War II, which ended in 1945, and the rise in the Black middle class in the 1980s has oriented many away from radical Black perspectives and socialist theory towards meritocracy based on capitalist economic development, educational aspirations, and endorsement of a broad program touted by Dr. King called the Revolution of Values. As the authors of Let Nobody Turn Us Around, an African American anthology note, most Black icons strived against the status quo to educate, agitate, and organize, resulting in many facing exile, imprisonment, and death for their beliefs. If we are to live up to the aspirations of Dr. King to push the moderates to action, as was outlined in his letter from a Birmingham jail of 1963, live up to the aspirations of the Constitution as so many Black advocates demanded, and foster a rainbow coalition of dissenters during times of crisis like President Obama did, then we must learn the lessons of history which show us that whenever a group of people come together to assert their rights, that is when political aspirations take place. For America to form a new left to resolve its crisis in democracy occurring today, which also occurred in the 1850s and 1860s, led by President Lincoln, early 1900s, led by Eugene Debs, 1930s and 1940s, led by President FDR, 1950s and 1960s, led by Dr. King, and finally in 2008, led by President Obama, U.S. citizens must identify their fundamental problems, political aspirations, and form a coalition to resolve them. Most importantly, we must remember that only a true working class movement that has a meaningful vision and operates from the grassroots can force changes in local government and the halls of Washington. That meaning and hope is seated in the Constitution, the beloved community, and the humanity which is inherent to a person and nation, which starts right at conception, as Frederick Douglass, President Lincoln, and President Obama envisioned. As long as that meaning and hope stays alive, so will the fundamental ideas of American democracy remain. So I thank you for listening to for joining me with this 10-part series on Black intellectual thought and history since the founding of the American Republic. And I just want to conclude by saying this book ends with the seminal election of Obama in 2008, but we have to realize that it's been around 16 years since the election of Obama, so many things have changed. Not only has there been a significant shift in the courts towards conservatism, but there's also been a rise in radical Black politics as seen through the Black Lives Matter movement. And this really is going to determine how the Americans decide to shape not just a third party, but a third force, as Louis Farrakhan said, to push the two-party system or even replace one of the parties to provide a new agenda that speaks to the working class. The Democratic Party used to represent the working class, but for some reason, the Democratic Party has strayed away from working class people's aspirations. There's been a decrease in wages since the 1970s and 1980s, while corporations and billionaires have gotten more and more money. So what has to happen is a formation of a new left, as has occurred throughout American history, in order to counter the aspirations of lobbyists and corporations, which have really stolen the narrative away from the American people. So what really needs to happen is the development of a new left in America, which can really provide a new consensus of ideas, which can propel America forward with more progress while also supporting working class people and poor Americans, because America is a very rich country and no one should be poor in this country or struggling. And because of what is happening currently in our government, we will see a greater push towards the development of a new left, or if not a new left, a coalition which will demand greater rights for all Americans and represent not just Black people, but all people in America and the aspirations of American democracy. So I thank you for listening for this 10-part series, and I'll be back with new podcasts and new guests as I continue forward with my podcast and YouTube channel. My YouTube channel, again, is Sunny Sharma at India Insight Movement, and my podcast is India Insight with Sunny Sharma. So I thank you for listening in this 10-part series and this conclusion. So thank you again, and hope to see you guys in the future with new podcasts. Okay, thank you.